also an advisor to the Prime Minister's office, particularly on economics. Then we have Erik Brynjolfsson, who's head of the Digital Economy Lab at Stanford. Then we have Keiko Toshiro, who's deputy president of Daiwa Securities. And finally, Scott Meinard of Guggenheim Partners in the US, who are big investors in Japan. So I'd be interested to hear from all of you on the new outlook. Now, one of the themes that we're going to focus on is Prime Minister Kishida's new capitalism and what that might mean. But I want to start on a more general theme. So, Takanaka-san, if you could give us a sense of how things feel in Japan in the sense of, are you through the pandemic? What's the economic mood? And of course, President Biden was just there last week, so there's a lot of very sharp geopolitical questions with the deterioration in relations between China and the West.
Well, thank you very much for raising a very stimulating question. First of all, I'd like to say, a little regret. Today, our Prime Minister couldn't come to Davos. There, he's having a very busy week. President Biden is visiting Tokyo, and a very important Quad, a very strategic dialogue among Australia, India, the United States, and Japan being held. But anyway, under such circumstances, it's very meaningful for us to discuss the current situation and the future of the Japanese economy. Honestly speaking, the Japanese society and economy is relatively stable. Stable means, well, the growth rate itself is not very high. Maybe the Cabinet Office predicts the economic growth rate of this fiscal year will be 3.2%, sorry. But market economists predict mostly around 2% growth is okay. So not very high. At the same time, the supporting ratio to Kishida cabinet is really high, 60% supporting ratio. This is very high in Japan's standard. And also the rate of unemployment is very, very low, 2.5% level. Almost full employment is reached. So under such circumstances, I can say also the pandemic, well, total death ratio, the ratio of deaths of pandemic to the total population is quite low in the case of Japan, about 1/4 or 1/5 of that of the United States or so. So in that sense, people are very quiet. And also under such circumstances, 7 months ago, a new prime minister appeared, Mr. Kishida, and he advocated the need for the new capitalism. We have domestically also a lot of discussions on this. What is that? Where is beef or something like that? Well, still, it's very difficult to evaluate the idea of the new capitalism. There are two reasons. One is what Prime Minister said had been changing little by little without debate. And the second one is where we are going to have upper house election in July. So considering that, Prime Minister is a very, very conservative, and to calm down the very controversial policy discussion. So it is very difficult to predict what's the real core of the new capitalism. But anyway, it is very important to consider the relationship between the government sector and the private sector. Well, in the case of Japan, the government function, the governance is not very strong. In the case of the pandemic, the government could not give order to private sector. They just requested the private sector to cooperate like that. So in that sense, the government role should be strengthened. Also, income distribution should be strengthened, I think. At the very first beginning, Prime Minister said, well, income redistribution is very important. Sometimes ignoring the importance of the growth strategy. But nowadays, he says, the virtuous circle between the growth and income distribution is needed. So anyway, the society is relatively quiet, and the policy discussion is relatively quiet. However, beyond the upper house election, what kind of policy Prime Minister will take? We are waiting for the new decision-making by Prime Minister in that sense.
Okay, thanks for that very clear introduction. Keiko, if I can turn to you. My interpretation of that is that the new capitalism is still something of a mystery. And we've had these previous relaunches. Everyone remembers Prime Minister Abe and Abenomics and so on. So periodically you get these attempts to kind of put Japan in a new direction. From somebody, on the investing business side, what do you think of what do you think it all means, and how do you see it as a kind of business proposition?
I think I want to actually add on to what the professor just said.
Please do,
because
yeah.
I agree with all what he said, but from a business side, I think there's also some frustration regarding the situation we are in Japan right now, because you still need a visa to come to Japan, although you don't need to quarantine. So when I travel abroad, I see all the economic activity in Europe and the US, but Japan's still very closed. Yeah. And I think the business community is very frustrated that the government is not moving quicker.
Do you see any prospect of that changing?
So everybody is hinging on the elections that the professor just mentioned, which is in July.
Yeah.
But so we're expecting a lot of change after that, because we know that after the elections, he will have 3 years that he doesn't have to hold elections. Right. But in terms of COVID, they are gradually opening up. But foreigners still need a visa, and we're still not open to travelers. So it's very frustrating, to be honest. And regarding the new capitalism and the second question that you asked, I think, as the professor said, we don't see the whole vision. I think they're expecting something in June, next month. And he has been changing. And I think the idea of growth and distribution is actually a theme that all Western capitalism countries are facing. So that concept itself, I don't think is really new. Maybe it's stakeholder capitalism. But I think initially, a lot of it, the emphasis was on the redistribution part, and businesses were more concerned because we really need growth. And I think he's catching up. For our industry, just 2 weeks ago, I think, he was in London, and he mentioned that growth is important. And he also mentioned about individual investors having more tax incentives to invest in the equity market or in any investment products, which is very new. I think everybody was surprised when he announced that. But for our industry, and I think for everybody, that is a sign that it's actually willing to listen, and growth is a big issue for him.
Okay. So, Scott, I mean, as an outside investor, what do you make of it all? I mean, there obviously does seem to be this tension between trying to create a more equitable form of capitalism, but not forgetting that businesses need to make profits.
Well, yeah, Tachihiro is correct. The equitable nature of capitalism is a big issue everywhere. I think that she brings up something very interesting, which is it's really not the equality issue as much as it's the growth and opportunity issue. That the gap that has occurred in the United States between incomes and wealth has widened. And the idea is, no, why don't we need to just lift all parts of the economy. Now, the new capitalism, Abenomics, which is a much more straightforward set of policies, which was, to control interest rates, expand the size of the deficits, to work to get rid of gender inequality within the country, and to open the nation up to more immigration of some form because of the shrinking population. I think now, since a lot of these issues are thought to be resolved, for instance, the deflationary pressure seems to be behind us, I think it's a much more difficult path for the policymakers to steer here. And I think part of that revolves around innovation. One of the things that, as an investor, that I note is venture capital, in the way we look at venture capital in the West or in the United States, is not nearly as available in Japan. And so some would argue that's a societal thing, that Japan is not focused on basic innovation. But the other side is, as we were discussing in the speaker ready room today, is Japan leads the world in many areas like robotics. And so there are opportunities there to be exploited, but I don't believe that the current framework opens it up enough to make it more capital more available to everybody, including small entrepreneurs.
Just a quick follow-up before I turn to Eric. I mean, you paint a kind of mixed picture, but you are a big investor. So what kind of opportunities are you looking for in Japan?
Well, we're looking mostly for technology because I think that's where we have an edge, that's where they have an edge, and certainly Eric and Stanford and the work we do with Stanford and the network we have in Silicon Valley, there are a lot of opportunities that we would like to see from Japan, but we're not seeing nearly enough. Most of the stuff we do is with SoftBank and others that are already established in the region.
Right.
So,
Okay. Well, Eric, that cues you up perfectly. I mean, this is your area. Where do you see Japan's technological distinctiveness and its potential advantages?
Sure. Well, the whole world is really in a stage of fundamental transformation driven by some big technologies, especially around AI and robotics. Japan has been a leader in that. I think we have a challenge for all of our society to create not just prosperity, but shared prosperity. A lot of people are being left behind. And the new capitalism, I think, should be applauded for grappling head on with some of these issues and bringing them to the front. I love the vision. The details, I think, aren't as fleshed out as they could be, but it's pointing in the right direction, and it's something that the rest of the world can learn from. Japan has been a leader in many of these areas for a number of reasons. One, I mean, we all know Japan has a strong technological base, innovating so much, especially in manufacturing, robotics. A second reason is the demographics. Japan is, you could say, ahead of the rest of the world in terms of this demographic transition that we're all going through. Japan's population is older and aging. They don't have as many immigrants. And so those things combine to put them further along to where Europe is going, where China is going, where the United States will be going. One of the things that means is that when you have an older population, you have a greater dependency ratio, you have fewer people in the working age population, and that switches around the labor demand. You end up having a lot more demand for automation and robotics when you don't have as much of a workforce. So Japan has been embracing that ahead of a lot of other people. And thirdly, there's a cultural difference. I've been a fan of following Japan since I was a kid, reading a lot of the science fiction and other things, and there's just a very different attitude towards robots and technology there than there is in a lot of other places. Robots are usually kind of evil in American popular media, but in Japan they're usually friendly, and people, whether they're older people or kids, they love robots. So you put these three things together, and you get a milieu that actually puts them in the forefront on a lot of these transitions. And I think when you combine that with the new capitalism, you see that the rest of the world can learn a lot from what's happening there.
Yeah, Takanaka-san, I'd like to ask you about geopolitics in a second, but just a quick question on robots and immigration, because Scott was making the point that one of the themes of Abe's period was to try to open Japan a bit up more to immigration. Is that still the case, or are you going to in fact say we'd like a lot of robots to look after us rather than immigrants?
Well, immigration, robots, both are needed, maybe. And as for immigration policies concerned, while Abe government and Suga government try to open up the labor market to the foreigners, actually the situation is being improved. However, one problem is, in the case of Japan, the government have not distinguished the difference between temporary immigration and permanent immigration. This should be concerned. So the legal framework should be strengthened more. But at this moment, this kind of discussion is very not active in Japan because, pandemic, as was mentioned by Keiko-san,
yes,
Japan is
nobody's coming into Japan right now.
And as for robot, yes, there's a very interesting episode where Toyota has been making use of many robots in the very, even in the 1980s and 90s. And a Toyota company gave name to each robot. That's like feel very friendly. Dealing with this robot as a human being. So this kind of mentality is held by the general public. So in that sense, making use of robot is very important, and that we have a lot of possibility.
Okay.
Now, if I could add something on, one of the things that made robots successful in Toyota was the relationship between employers and employees there. In the United States, GM introduced a lot of robots and used it to lay off a lot of people. So immediately the workers saw the machines as a threat. In Japan, there was more of a lifetime employment culture, so the employees didn't see them as a threat, rather something that could help make their work easier and work together. So there's a very different mindset.
That's very interesting, yeah. Keiko, let's turn, if we can, a bit to the geopolitical thing, which I think fits in with the economics, because you now hear Janet Yellen, for example, talking about not getting rid of offshoring, but maybe friendshoring, doing more, by implication, less with China and more with allied countries. Is that potentially an opportunity for China, particularly for Japan, particularly given, as you say, that Japan's cost base is coming down?
So I think even before what's happening now, we have been discussing about bringing back more manufacturing to Japan because manufacturing is becoming high-tech. So I think apart from what Janet Yellen is saying, that is a trend that has been considered. So I think it will continue.
And how, so remanufacturing, it's quite an interesting theme because obviously that was something that Trump was talking about, that these jobs haven't gone forever. Do you actually see it happening, or is it just a thought at the moment?
So I think it's things that companies are actually reconsidering, but the reason why we would do that is very different from what Mr. Trump was saying, is that it's not because we're losing jobs.
Yeah.
We don't have we have, so it's very different.
Yeah.
I think it's more the growth and the potential part of bringing it back to Japan than bringing it back for a different cause.
Yeah.
Economic security promotion law was approved the other day in the Diet. Economic security.
Right.
This means, to some extent, manufacturing companies overseas should come back to Japan, and the government decided to provide some grant to support this kind of investment. So in that sense, considering the geopolitical situation, the government is ready to help these manufacturing industries, domestic investment. At the same time, as was mentioned by Keiko-san, business sectors is ready to accept this kind of change.
I think it also has to do with getting money into the regions outside of Tokyo, because they are suffering from lack of, everybody's coming to Tokyo, there's a loss of population, the cities and the towns are growing smaller. So that is also to help that issue that we have.
Yeah, obviously in the United States at the moment, there's this big debate about decoupling with China. And it's deeply complicated. Some people say it's not even possible. Is there any similar debate in Japan? Because, of course, there's been huge Japanese investment in China. A lot of that manufacturing from Japan moved into China. Is decoupling something that people think about at all?
Of course, no one prefers decoupling. So globalization should be continued. At the same time, some robustness is needed for the economy. Under such circumstances, very conservative politicians in the ruling party, approved this economic security law. Of course, this is important in general, but too strict, restrictions on globalization will enhance the cost of production and also lower the standard of living of the people. So we have to be very careful, the balance of free trade and also economic security.
Yeah. Scott, you were saying earlier that you thought that the development of the Quad was a very significant moment and that Biden's now trying to promote this Indo-Pacific economic framework. What do you think is going on?
Well, I think that he's relabeling the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? And it's politically unfavorable in the United States. For no good reason other than it made good political rhetoric in the last election, or in the Trump election with Clinton. But, I think now people are, in the United States, are looking at, we need alternatives to China. We feel extremely vulnerable in the supply chain to China. And we recognize that, we do need to have some offshore production. And so it would be nice to have friends in the region like Korea, Japan, and we hope India, obviously, that these nations could work with us to provide two objectives. One, not just a vibrant economic growth in the United States by securing a more diverse supply chain, but also to increase a counterweight economically to China in the region. The comments that we've heard in the last week around Taiwan, there's a lot of practically xenophobic fear in Washington that the Chinese are going to move on Taiwan. And so, we would like to build stronger alliances in the region, both for military and economic reasons.
Yeah. I mean, Eric, how practical is all this talk? I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, talking to one of America's kind of leading tech names who was saying, this is craziness to try to sort of cut China out of the tech world. So much good research is coming out of there. We're so integrated already. What's your view on it?
Well, to be frank, my views evolved a bit. So like a lot of academics, I've spent time in China and had a lot of academic friends and colleagues there, and my natural instinct is to have a lot of exchange. But I've seen that the tensions have been rising in both sides, and there is, I think, a growing need to have more separation on some of the dimensions. It's not practical to have a complete separation, but there are areas in parts of manufacturing, for instance, because of 3D manufacturing, additive manufacturing, and other tools, you can actually reshore a lot of things, and so you don't need to have as extended a supply chain. In other areas like chip production, there's still a lot of need for specialized ecosystems in places like Taiwan and Japan and others that are difficult to reshore that sort of a way. But we're seeing with the lockdowns in Shanghai and elsewhere, that there's a lot of vulnerabilities that have been created by those kinds of very complicated supply chains. And there's some academic research about the fragility when you have a very complicated supply chain, that individual actors don't always have the private incentives to consider the knock-on effects of if one piece of it shuts down, that's bad, they lose profits. But it also affects, dozens of other companies in other countries that also lose profits, and that's an externality that isn't always taken into account. So creating a more robust supply chain is something that I think does require some public attention, ways of doing that, creating buffers. The private market won't necessarily get you to the optimal level of that. Of course, my preference would be that these tensions would die down and that we would be able to have a more peaceful coexistence, but you can't always count on people acting in a rational way that way. We see some pretty crazy things happening in Ukraine and elsewhere, and you have to have a scenario planning where you're able to manage without having as big a catastrophic effect on your economy if things don't go the way that you hope they do.
Yeah, I'll turn to the audience in 1 second, but just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, it's interesting as people talk about technological diversification within Asia. There's been a lot of talk about chip manufacture in Taiwan. There's been talk about India. It seems to me that Japan's been weirdly not absent from the conversation, but not as central to the conversation as it should be, given its size, its technological advances. I mean, where do you feel that Japan's role in all this may increase?
Well, it depends on the different parts of the supply chain. So Japan actually does play a pretty big role in a lot of the core technologies, and I think there's some, just as there's some reshoring to the United States, there's some big in the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress, there's about a $50 billion bill to support semiconductor manufacturing and actually additive manufacturing in the United States that's about to be passed. And I think similarly in Japan, you guys would know better, there are efforts to bring some of that more domestically. So I think some of that is happening. Of course, a few years ago, the pendulum was much more towards a lot of concentration in Taiwan, but that's geopolitically a risky place to have that.
Yes, one point.
Please, yeah.
Yes, the free and open Indo-Pacific concept.
Yeah.
Well, this was advocated first by Prime Minister Abe 15 years ago. At first, this was mostly focusing the security issue. However, this is now including the economic issue. In that sense, Japan is going to play a very important role, even in the economic cooperation, including technology. And also, at the Quad Summit meeting was held this week in Tokyo, and at the same time, President Biden is going to start the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This will be, in a sense, on the same concept. So in that sense, Japan is going to play a very important role even in the technology cooperation. Yeah.
Sure, Japan's been pushing the Indo-Pacific for a long time as one of the first to do it, really. So let me turn to the audience for questions. I think if the lights come up a little bit, I might even be able to see you. There's a guy in the front row, if we could get a microphone to him. If you could stand up, it's easy for the camera people.
Mr. Hori.
My name is Yoshi Hori of Globius. I have a question to Professor Takenaka. You mentioned that Japan is stable. I agree. But in the world, there's a mention about inflation and also exchange rate. Japan yen is becoming so low. What is your view about the inflation of Japan, and what do you think should be done economically?
Well, thank you very much for raising a very important questions. Well, although I said the situation is very stable, we still have some problems. One is the inflation is now little by little advancing, and also reflecting that also the exchange rate depreciation, yen depreciation is very serious. While a year ago, $1 was 110 yen, now 130 yen, 20% decline. And this is the story of the nominal exchange rate, but the real problem in the real effective exchange rate. This real effective exchange rate, current rate, is the lowest for the past 50 years. So this is reflecting many things. One is the energy price hike, and the one is the interest rate gap between Japan and the United States and so on. But one serious one is the fundamentals of the Japanese economy. Well, very regrettably, well, as was mentioned by our panelists, Japan has a strong potential. However, potential is not realized yet. Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Suga try to maximize our potential. But Mr. Kishida is succeeding that. So in that sense, much more very aggressive and very active reform is needed. For example, in Japan, while Japan is not a country of new liberalism, while new liberalism created some income gap, it is generally accepted. But Japan is not a country of new liberalism, a lot of regulations. And so the income gap is not so serious compared with other advanced countries. But we have to liberalize more. At the same time, we have to strengthen the government function of focusing on income redistribution. We already have a progressive tax rate, but we have to do more, something more. This is a task for the Kishida government. But basically, Kishida government is also succeeding the basic idea of Abenomics and Suganomics. That's my observation.
Getting a comment on
please,
this. Yeah. I think one of the fundamental problems that Japan is facing right now is that yield curve control and monetary policy was designed for a period of crisis in Japan. Now that the deflation seems to be behind us, the reality is that you cannot have yield curve control and control the value of the yen at the same time, right? You're going to have to pick one or the other. Mm-hmm. And so escaping from yield curve control and managing a way to slow down the growth in the money supply in Japan is probably the most critical element in stabilizing the yen. But having said that, I think that the weak yen is working to the advantage of Japan today because it's making it much more competitive on a global stage, but this is not sustainable in the long run.
I was going to say that one of the themes just wandering around the Congress Hall is certainly among the Western countries, the sense that inflation is back, double-digit inflation. Mm-hmm. Is that, Japan oddly has been in this period where you were trying to get a bit of inflation.
Yes.
But are you also worried by this idea that inflation might get out of control or not?
So I think right now inflation is at 2% or above because of various reasons that everybody experiencing. But the expectation for our company is that it is not going to continue, that it won't go like 8% like it is in the U.S. But that's also a concern for a totally different reason, meaning that everybody's going to be raising interest rates, and we might not be able to.
Might not be able to because it's...
Because we wouldn't have to.
Right, okay. So it's the gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Akio Fuji from Nikkei newspaper. Today's front page news of Financial Times is not about Davos, unfortunately. And it covers Quad meeting in Japan and joint bombers exercise by Russian and Chinese over the Sea of Japan. So ever is more worry about tension in this region. So from the investor's point of view, I'd like to ask Mr. Minard, how do you see a risk in this area, especially in Japan? And also, Mr. Kishida, last time in London speech, he said invest in Kishida. So are there any opportunity, which area do you think opportunity in investing in Japan?
Well, it's interesting that that current situation with the South China Sea is part of a bigger issue for the United States, and clearly there's going to be a lot more investment have to be made in defense, and defense is moving not so much to the traditional defense of aircraft carriers and fighters, but more toward technology, artificial intelligence, directed energy weapons. Hypersonic is a concern, but directed energy is of much more importance in this area. I think that the slow evolution of Japan in its view toward its military involvement in the region is of extreme importance to the United States. And I think the opportunity there is in the area of technological investment. I think that the dynamics of the Ukraine has changed the perception of most of the developed world. That this is not just some remote threat. And I will tell you that as an investor, that I am probably more concerned today about those kinds of threats than I was during the Cold War, because it feels the Cold War was a situation where it was essentially a bipolar world, right? Today we were much more fractured, and the events in Europe are opening up potential opportunities for powers in Asia. So I think that we have to move with haste to formulate a plan where the democratic nations in Asia can come together as a counterweight to totalitarian powers.
Eric?
Well, Scott's exactly right. There's what some military people call a third offset around artificial intelligence and advanced weaponry that can be a counterbalance to some of the traditional, certainly aircraft carriers and some of the old ways of doing things. Whenever they do the war games, the traditional weapon systems are quickly wiped out. You see some of this happening in Ukraine already, where the drones are taking out some of the tanks and other weapons. So it's imperative for the nations to modernize and use in cyber, AI, and drones and other advanced weaponry. So there's got to be a mindset change there. But that's one of the areas where Japan and the United States and the West have an advantage. They have a huge technological advantage, and they can emphasize that. The other thing is there's a big economic advantage, and if you look at the relative size of the economies, there's just so much more resources there. And if they work together, they can. It was fractured for some time, but there's a strength there. And last but not least, I would say there's a leading by example. And I think that the people in China and Russia and other countries, they're somewhat cut off from what's happening in the world. But I think a lot of information does get in. And to the extent that there's been a lot of dysfunction in democracies in Europe, United States, and elsewhere, that's been a bad example. But to the extent that there can be an example of freedom working and us working through this, that can be better. The dysfunction has been a problem in some of these countries, but then you look at what's going on in Russia or in China with these strange lockdowns, and I think it underscores Winston Churchill's point that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And you see that these other systems are not able to cope with things, and they lead to some dysfunctions that are even worse. So I'm hopeful that as these threats grow, there will be a increasingly united front of the majority of the world that is free and is working in a way to protect the integrity of those countries.
Yeah, I want to make one point, Eric, you made very briefly.
Yeah, because there are others.
Yeah, we are moving to a new era in warfare. This is technological war.
Right.
This is not the traditional way that wars were fought, and we need to get past that mentality in our policymakers.
Okay. Yeah. Further questions? Yes, gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Taisuke Sasanuma. I'm running a private equity fund in Advantage Partners in Japan. I'd like to ask a question to Tashiro-san and Takenaka-sensei about the Japan-China relationship. So how should we, private sector, consider or recognize as China for us? Can it still be our market, or we just really withdraw from China? It has been observed that in the last several decades, politics and businesses are different. Yeah. Even though there are some dispute between the countries and politicians scream each other, but we are doing business very healthily. But gradually, I'm observing that those two movements is getting to be coherent, and then even private sector should think about the withdraw the business in China. So I'm really at the point of some decision to how should we commit to China or not. So I would like the advice from you.
So we have a joint venture in China that started operations last June. And obviously we're very concerned about the direction we want to go. But on the other hand, there are areas that we can work together. And I'm going to say about net zero, which is everybody has to do it. And with China, we need to get China involved because they need to do it themselves. They're going to aim for 2060. They need the technology. They are willing to invest in the technology. And as an international community, I think it's very difficult to ignore what China can contribute to a 2050 net zero. And so rather than trying to sort of alienate them, I think what we can do to try to get them on an equal footing in terms of some of the issues that we need to solve globally is I think that's the approach in my mind that I want to take. And I think we will be very careful watching China, but I'm not in a position to say retreat right now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Very important but difficult question. Well, so far, the Japan government and businesses have been taking the following attitude. While we share the value with the United States and some other Western countries, but at the same time, China is a very important strategic trade partner. Well, we share value with the Western, but approach is a little bit different on China. Well, this is a kind of ambiguity. Ambiguity policy is important to some extent, but this ambiguity coverage should be a little bit narrowed at this moment. That's the current position. Well, as far as the economic side is concerned, China is very important. So domestic markets should be, should be very important for Japanese businesses. However, from here on, well, so far, China was in a sense of the production base for export, but this function would be reduced. But yesterday, the Secretary General of NATO said, freedom is much more important than free trade. Very impressive word. However, this is really strict. Freedom and free trade are related to each other to some extent. So I do not have any concrete idea or nothing. But ambiguity policy should be included, continued. But this, the coverage is a little bit narrowed. That's the current position.
Okay, more questions? Yes, the woman over there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Atoka Jo. I'm a global shaper from Japan. Thank you for the panel today. And so I was wondering, I as mentioned in the discussion, aging population is a big problem in Japan. And I'm part of the so-called Gen Z generation. And so I'm wondering what role, in order to bring back the liveliness and strength of Japan, what role should the youth play? And what do you think that the older generation should do to make that happen?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this whole, it's a fascinating
The older
question. The whole question of generational fairness is a very big one, even in the West. You know, as societies get older, do they kind of forget about the incentives for the young?
So can I take a
please,
grab at
you
that?
start,
I think the most important thing that we can do is not be afraid of change. I think that's where, in Japan, our generation and some older generation they can't change. I can say this because I can say this, and I'm going to say, well, I can say this because something that we didn't talk about, which is for me very concerning, is that for inclusion and diversity, we are getting nowhere.
Well, despite all the rhetoric of Abe.
Despite everything that everybody's saying, and that's what I mean by we can't change, and I think that's a big difference. And I think going to the younger generation is also change that we have to embrace, but we're not right now. We're trying, but we're not. I think that's
I have one request to the younger generation. Please go for voting. Right? Voting ratio, younger generation, very low in Japan. This is quite unique for Japan. In other countries, where younger generation have some complaints on the current situation, they go for voting. But Japanese young people don't go for voting. Of course, we have to change. So it's very difficult for us to change. But anyway, much more, what I say, I really expect much more active role in the political decision-making for the young
But it's not their fault. It's our fault that they're going to vote. Really.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, I think it's interesting, but I mean, you know, everyone says with a smile, well, yeah, we all say we're going to change, but we never do. I mean, why is that? And is that because people aren't serious about it?
So I actually think about regarding diversity and inclusion, that is the problem that we have. I think the women that need to be in equal footing, the reason why they are trying to get them in the workforce is because of their labor, because of the falling population. It's not because they have diverse ideas. And I have a big problem with that. You can probably see me because I'm getting very angry. But that's a big problem that we have, and that's underlying everything that we've been talking about in terms of investment, in terms of innovation. Because, I mean, so sorry.
No, I think it's...
That's okay. Well, WEF is issuing gender gap index. According to that, Japan is ranked 120th or something like that, quite low. That this index combined 14 indices. Among 14, 4, Japan is the first. You have the education on the primary and middle level. However, the number of politicians and the number of specialists, these are quite low. So it is very important to change this kind of, if we change the 3 indices among 14, the Japan's situation will be improved a lot. Well, this is the problem to be focused.
I didn't think of
hijacking
the discussion.
We're coming. No, I think that's a very good note to end on. We're coming to the end. Thank you to all the panel, and I think, as you were saying, that's a positive agenda for the future to get serious about giving more opportunities to the young, to women in Japan, and that could be a huge kind of potential boost for the country in the future. So thank you all to the audience, thanks to the panel, and I hope we'll see you all next year and have even more of a take on what Prime Minister Kishida has done with the new capitalism.
Right.
Cheers.